Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Soapbox Theology. This is Pastor Gabe. We're continuing to look at the book of First Timothy, and we are now to the final chapter, chapter 6. And I think we're just going to hit these first two verses here. And this will be regarding the issue of slavery and bondservants in the Roman culture. So let's read these first two verses. 1 Timothy 6:1. Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants or slaves regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. Teach and urge these things. So that is pretty scandalous to 21st century ears, but as we talked about before when we looked at Philemon, slavery in Rome was different than what we normally think of slavery here in America. Here it was chattel slavery. It was people were nothing but property. They weren't valued. It was clearly a system also based on economy, but it wasn't race-based. Rome slavery was basically anyone that they would have gone to war with. But on top of that, slavery didn't necessarily mean you were unskilled. There certainly was unskilled workers, and they would work on farms and doing mining and that sort of thing. But there was many skilled workers, and they were highly valued. There was actually doctors who would be considered slaves. All that to say that slavery was different. There would, I believe, just some of the research I've looked at, some of the overall of the Roman Empire, I believe there would have been a large number of slaves. Some areas, overall, I think it's about 15%, but depending on particular cities and hubs, there would be a large number of slaves, and especially in Ephesus, and that's where Paul's writing. Timothy is ministering in Ephesus, and Ephesus was a known hub of slave trading. So there would have possibly been even more slaves in Ephesus than the traditional, and certainly some cities would have had larger slave populations than others, depending on the type of commerce that happened in the city. And so, in fact, it was so common that this is saying that there might not only be slaves, but there might also be believing masters as well. And again, so we have to understand that there wouldn't have been an immediate outcry of people are slaves, that's wrong. Again, this would have been one of the ways that they handled their economy. Would have been one of the ways that they handled homelessness and poverty. In fact, you could make the argument so that someone would rather be a slave than think about the New Testament. How often there's people that are so impoverished that they're just sitting on the side of the road, begging, sick from birth, perhaps out just left on the street, and up to the mercy of people who pass them by. So many people would rather be in a position of being a slave, because then you have a job, you have shelter, you have sustenance, you're taken care of, you're looked after, and especially so if you were a skilled worker. So it's not at all like the way that we naturally here in 21st century America, and even around the world, would respond to the idea of there was slavery. There was slavery, and it was different. Furthermore, slavery in the Old Testament, as we talked about before, was a similar thing where it was a form of to maintain the economy. People literally would go into slavery to avoid the fate that we were just talking about that so often occurred in the New Testament. And so to have a leader, to have a master looking over you was not necessarily regarded as a horrible thing. And so that's what Paul is speaking to here. If you're in that situation, so let all those who are under a yoke regard their own masters as worthy of honor. Okay? They're doing, again, sounds terrific to us, but they were doing a thing where they're providing for other people, allowing them to work in their house, providing shelter, providing food, and obviously their own. And then there was that certainly that idea that they weren't totally free, but that wouldn't have carried the same problems that it carries for us immediately in our day. So it tells them, if you are a slave, regard your master as worthy of honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. This is very interesting. What this is saying is the gospel message was not largely a political movement. It wasn't about upturning systems of slavery. It was about people's main problem. People's main problem is sin with God. And so their relationship with God. And so this was saying, if you have that relationship with God, then understand that you can still honor your master, because the most important thing has been taken care of, your relationship between God. And again, the point is the gospel wasn't supposed to be associated necessarily with insurrection, like completely turning the political systems on their head. That's not the message. The message was not, come to Jesus, be freed of your earthly bondage. It's come to Jesus and be freed of your spiritual bondage. The freedom that you mainly find is in Christ, is becoming adopted, coming into His family, and being released from sin. So it wasn't necessarily about those other things. And frankly, Christianity would have been probably crushed if it was viewed as sort of an emancipatory religion, where the minute you got saved, you just act like you don't have masters. I mean, they would have been wiped out and killed very quickly if that was the message. But that's not the message, and it has never been the message. As we looked at in Philemon, it's obtain your freedom if you can, right? If you're able to. Obviously, to serve the Lord in freedom is better than in bondage. But this is saying you can still honor God in your bondage. And that's certainly, we can admit that down through time, this passage has been misused in that they take it out of the economic system of Rome, and which would, in a similar, almost have at least a similar picture to the economic system that in Israel, but was not at all the same from what we had here in America, because that was all, it's race based. It was based on kidnapping, which gets you the death penalty, by the way, in the Old Testament. It wasn't race based. It just wasn't the same. And so there are similarities, obviously, in all slavery, but slavery has been around forever. It's a way to address prisoners of war. It's a way to address the population when you don't have a prison system. It's a way to not just leave everyone destitute and end up dying. It's like you could take them in, and you could take care of them, and build a society around them. Okay. Again, it sounds horrible to us, but it was a way of life for them. So, regard your masters as honorable. One, why? Because you want your masters to turn and look at the slave and say, well, what's different about him? Why is he showing me so much respect? Why is he seems to genuinely think that I'm honorable, right? And the point would have been to get them to notice that Jesus is a real Savior. This is a real message. This is a real movement. Going on to the next verse. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. So again, it's saying, and there might be a situation where even a Christian, right, even a believer could have slaves. Again, it doesn't say this is a wickedness, immediately release them. It's recognizing that this was a system in play that actually prevented people from just being destitute and out on the street, from being totally impoverished and begging. This system is better than that. And we just need to be wise and recognize that. So you weren't allowed to disrespect your master, especially with their believers, because then now at that point, the demonstration of the witness to Christ is going two ways. The slave knows he has a believing master, and the master knows he has a believing slave. And so they both have to show that level of honor and respect. Also in the even in the Roman system, as this developed over time, because it was so common, it got to the point where slaves could file complaints against their master if their masters were totally mistreating them. That doesn't say it prevented all mistreatment, and I'm not saying that there never was mistreatment, but they certainly did have a certain amount of rights. And so that's actually interesting to be aware of. So rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. So again, the point of the gospel is not immediate emancipation, is not immediate equality, is not fixing all rights. It's the gospel first and foremost. That's the main thing. That's the most important thing. That's the most important relationship that needs to be fixed between a creature and his maker. And as that's in the right place, even in these systems that are not perfect, and that we might even want to criticize from the outside, there is a way that they can still give testimony to the surrounding culture and to one another about the risen Christ. And that is way more important. This is the same principle that Paul talks about in Corinthians about a wife staying with an unbelieving spouse, or a husband staying with an unbelieving spouse. It's like, if they don't want to leave the marriage, then stay in it, because who knows, husband or wife, if you might win them to the Lord by your faithfulness. And so that it's the same principle. Just because you're married to an unbeliever doesn't mean you immediately try to get out of that, because there's still the possibility, and the assumption is it may not be a great situation necessarily, but the assumption is you can still, by your conduct, win them to Christ. Again, that's the main thing, the relationship with Christ, the witness to Christ. And then he says, teach and urge these things. Timothy, make sure the people in your church understand this. You're probably going to have slaves. You're probably going to have masters there. And our message is not necessarily undermining that system. In fact, it's making that system more bearable, and even allowing for that system to have its own witness, in that people can be demonstrating Christ even in that. And again, we need to understand from the biblical perspective, we're supposed to rejoice in tribulation. We're not supposed to curse our bad circumstances and demand that they be changed. We're supposed to recognize, well, this is where I am. How can I serve Christ where I am? And leave it up to him to change those circumstances. Again, not commenting on what happens later in time. What happened here in America was sinful. It should have never happened, because, again, kidnapping is illegal. This wasn't race-based. It was to maintain economy, and it was to prevent poverty. And there were so many other ways that they're just different, that we just need to understand that it's different, and it's not a one-to-one correlation, and we're just wise to recognize that difference. So a good takeaway in this is, whatever situation you are in, serve the Lord. There's actually a verse about that. Okay, yeah. Let me just read this verse where Paul is writing to the Corinthians. This is over in 1 Corinthians 7. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Okay, here's the specific part applicable to us. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant? Again, the word is doulos, slave. When called, do not be concerned about it. And then it says, but if you can, gain your freedom. Avail yourself of the opportunity. Sure, it's not a sin to achieve freedom if you're a slave, if it's possible. But don't worry about it. For he was called in the Lord as a bondservant, as freeman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called as a bondservant of Christ. And so, you were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. Those are really hard words for us to hear today, because today it's like, no, we need to achieve equality. We need to fix all of the social ills. That's what the gospel is, they say, but it's not. The gospel is recognize where you are now and shine as a light where you are now, and if possible, achieve that freedom. And that would be great, but don't be concerned about it. Why? Because we are called now slaves of God, of Christ. That's why you don't worry about it, because you have a different master now. Jesus is the master. God's the master. And so we don't struggle to change our situation, because we are still a slave. We're a slave of Christ. We're a slave of Jesus. And we can honor him with our lives. And so, if you can get your freedom, sure, but, don't make that the end-all, be-all. Serve the Lord in whatever situation you're called. All right? Thanks, guys. Bye.